Rejection, the breaking of the ego, the liberation of the soul. The pain that shatters the ego empties what was never essential. There comes a moment when pain silences everything, not because the soul doesn't feel, but because the ego has screamed too much. When we are rejected, what breaks first isn't the heart. Pride. The same pride that believed itself irreplaceable, necessary, almost eternal. Being rejected sometimes doesn't break who we are. It reveals that what seemed so solid, so grand, was merely a fragile construct made to be admired. The ego wants control, wants to be remembered, wants to be indispensable. But the soul wants something else: silence, truth, rest. Seneca said, "The first punishment of pride is to be enslaved by expectation." And what a slavery this is, where we live hostage to others' responses, to the lack of attention, to the return that never comes. When we expect too much, we forget to simply be. Marcus Aurelius reminded us, everything that happens is natural. It only hurts because you expected the opposite. Pain is born from the discrepancy between what we thought we deserved and what was actually given to us. And in this fracture between the imagined and the lived, the ego crumbled. But the soul finally breathed. The image is clear, an imposing statue, but hollow inside. Rejection doesn't destroy the statue, it merely cracks it, revealing the emptiness that was already there. And it's in this emptiness that freedom begins, not because it's pleasant, but because it's honest. The soul, at last, no longer needs to bear the weight of perfection. It can just be itself, stripped, broken, real. Rejection breaks what was a mask, and in doing so, allows what is essence to finally move, even if slowly, even if it still hurts. It's in this cracked space that Stoic philosophy flourishes, not as empty consolation, but as compassionate firmness, not to tell you it was nothing, but to remind you that, yes, it hurt, and even so, you continue. And you continue freer than before, because now, you no longer need to prove yourself. You no longer need to beg for presents. You no longer need to build castles with walls of pride. Now, what remains is what is, and that, however simple it may seem, is everything. The inner collapse of the indispensable. It's strange to realize that what we held with such certainty suddenly makes no sense. When we believe ourselves irreplaceable, any distancing feels like an affront, a rupture with what we deemed untouchable. But what hurts isn't always the absence of the other. Sometimes truly wound is the image we had of ourselves, that idealized, inflated image, fed by gazes and validation. When this image shatters, the fall isn't from reality, it's from the ego, and it falls hard. In the absence of those who left, it's not just emptiness that remains, it's the frustration of having leaned on an illusory idea of importance, of having confused presence with necessity, of having believed that without you the other wouldn't go on, but they did, and you were left with the sound of silence. That's where the inner collapse begins. Not because the truth has changed, but because now it presents itself unadorned, raw, uncomfortable, liberating. The first crack isn't visible. It doesn't appear in conversations or tears. It happens within. It's the moment we realize we were more arrogance than love, that we carried a vanity disguised as affection, that we judged ourselves indispensable when we were merely company, and perhaps not always desired. And it's in this crack that the soul breathes for the first time without the weight of performance. This isn't about humiliation, it's about revelation. Pain shows us where we built too many castles and too few roots. It shows us where we expected recognition and reaped silence. And though it hurt, that's where Stoic philosophy gains strength. Because the Stoic doesn't rely on illusion, they rely on lucidity. And lucidity is this: realizing that we are not indispensable, and yet we are whole. We are valid. We are worthy, not because we occupy a place in another's life, but because we begin to occupy at last our own space. The liberation that only comes after shame. There's a pain that isn't physical, yet weighs on the shoulders as if it were shame. That silent sensation that darkens thoughts and makes us shrink inside. When we are rejected, the first reflex might be anger, disbelief, defense, but soon after, when the noise ceases, shame enters. The shame of having been left. The shame of having believed we were different, of having thought we were enough and we weren't. Yet this shame, however cruel it may seem, holds a secret. It's the beginning of liberation, because in it, all illusion begins to crumble. What once sustained the facade, the idea of strength, the appearance of control, the feeling of deserving, dissolve. And when all this falls, only what is true remains. The neediness hidden beneath smile, the fear of being forgotten, the emotional dependence masked as affect. Seneca said, "The soul only strengthens after being pierced by pain." And it is precisely in shame that this passage occurs. It's not punishment, it's a mirror. It shows how much we needed others' approval to validate our existence. It shows how fragile we still were, not for loving, but for depending. And in this revelation, the soul awakened, because everything that falls gives way to what can truly grow. When pride dissolves, something new can be born. no longer based on being necessary for another, but on being whole with oneself. And this wholeness doesn't scream, it doesn't demand, it doesn't impose itself. It simply remains firm, silent, serenely present. The shame that once hurt now purify. What seemed like humiliation transforms into a portal where the ego leaves wounded, but the soul at last emerges free. And from this freedom, something blossoms that no external validation can offer. Peace, the silence after abandonment, and what it taught about control. Silence, that soundless space which, when it arrives after abandonment, isn't peace. It's emptiness. It's as if the world has stopped talking to, and not because you wanted to hear less, but because you were no longer the chosen one. The ego, accustomed to answers, despairs. It wants explanations, justifications, promises of return. It wants to understand where it went wrong, why it wasn't enough, what it could have done differently. But the other's silence, however cruel it may seem, is the most honest answer, because it doesn't say what the ego wants to hear, it shows what reality has been saying for a long time, and that's where the discomfort arises, because the ego seeks control, and silence reveals that we have none. Marcus Aurelius said, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." The phrase is simple, but profound. It invites us to retreat from the other and inhabit ourselves more firmly. When the external noise ceases, the internal intensifies. The mind begins to scream everything that was avoided for so long, doubts, criticisms, memories, but gradually this chaos quiets, and what was once pain transforms into space to breathe, space to hear what was hidden beneath demands and mass. Silence, once oppressive, becomes fertile ground, a space where presence can be born, no longer as a reflection of the other, but as the root of one's own being. It is at this point that control changes form. It ceases to be the desire to mold the external world and becomes the discipline of caring for what happens within. And in this care, freedom begins to appear, no longer as an absence of pain, but as a choice of presence. Silence then ceases to be punishment. It becomes a portal, a path that needs no explanation, only the courage to continue in silent but whole. Pain as a path, not a sentence. The pain of rejection seems at first glance like a sentence, a decreed end, a silent verdict that we were not enough. But Stoicism, with its cutting calmness, reminds us that pain is not an end. It is a beginning. It is refinement. It is a past. Pain forces us to stop, to feel, to face without anesthesia what, out of vanity or fear, we always avoided seeing. The wounded soul begins to reveal itself in the rubble of pride, and it is there on the floor of emotional humiliation that the first seed of reconstruction is born. Seneca said that virtue only becomes firm after passing through trials, because it is easy to seem strong when everything is in our favor. Difficult is to maintain dignity when one is denied, when one is not chosen. When all that you offered was silently refused, the Stoic does not deny pain. They observe it, they integrate it, because they understand that suffering doesn't have to be resistant, it can be revelation. Pain doesn't have to be a punishment, can be the reflection of a soul that is leaving behind what no longer belongs to it. That is learning to exist without depending on the image the other had of it. And in this journey, something changed. The pain, which once seemed overwhelming, begins to show nuance, detail here, a lesson there. And then the recognition arrived. Not everything that hurt was a loss. Some pains were poorly wrapped liberation, and what seemed like injustice was merely realignment, a silent invitation to return to one. In the end, it all comes down to this. The ego suffers, soul learn, and when the ego falls silent, the soul finally breathes. Pain at this moment ceases to be a sentence, and it becomes a path, the path to a lighter life, more honest, more whole. The metaphor of the closed door and the window you opened yourself. There are pains that shut like doors, forcefully, loudly, with abrupt solitude, and when they close, they leave us in a dark, silent corridor where all we hear is the echo of wounded pride. But Stoic wisdom whispers another vision. The door may have closed, but it wasn't the only way out. Perhaps it was just the one we insisted on keeping open. It's in the silence of abandonment that the soul's presence is perceived. When all external voices cease, a window begins to form, small, discreet, without fanfare, and through it, not the other, but yourself entered. You, whole, without character, without the need to prove yourself. Epictetus reminds us, you don't control the door that closes, but you can choose what to do with the new landscape. And this inner landscape, sometimes so neglected, reveals that it's not the world that needs to change, but how we see it. It's not the other who needs to stay. It's you who needs to decide if you still want to remain in a place where there is no space to breathe. The ego's door closes with a clang, but the soul's window opens in silence. And it's in this subtle opening that life begins to enter again, without demand, without begging for affection, without negotiating one's own dignity. At that instant, something profound happened. You realize that it was never the other's absence that hurt so much. It was the absence of yourself. It was how much you had abandoned yourself trying to be accepted. It was how much you had bent over backward not to be left. The window, now open, shows a new landscape, not from outside but from within. And there, in the reclaimed intimacy, freedom finally begins to be born. Because no rejection has power over someone who has learned to embrace themselves. Because no closed door is more powerful than a soul willing to continue. Rejection, the pain, but also the severing of ties with what no longer fit. There are pains that feel like an end, but with time, with the right breath, with the silence listened to from within, we understand. They were beginnings in disguise. The rejection that once broke the ego, in truth, freed the soul. And liberation, when it comes, is never noisy. It's a gentle breaking, like releasing a weight carried for too long. Seneca concludes with disconcerting clarity. Not every loss is an absence. Sometimes it is relief. And this relief is only possible when we stop confusing presence with dependent, acceptance with survival. The ego screams for control. The soul whispers for truth. The ego wants to be seen. The soul wants to be felt. Marcus Aurelius adds, if something breaks you, it's because you were attached to it. And when we finally let go, what seemed like irreparable pain reveals itself merely as the end of an illusion. Because what is real within us does not break, does not humiliate itself. It does not bend to be loved. It simply remains firm, silent, and alive. In the silence of rejection, often the greatest encounter is born, the reunion with oneself. And in this encounter, the gaze changes, the step changes, the breath changes, because now one no longer walks to be accepted. One walks to be whole. The final image is not one of loss. It is of shelter, a shelter built from what remained after the fall. Firm, silent, true, and within its base where the ego no longer needs to prove itself because the soul at last is at peace.